Good evening. This is Michael Wong. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Veterans for Peace China Working Group, and I'm here today with Professor John Walsh, who I'm pleased to interview. Our subject matter today is going to be Gaza, China, and the world. Professor John Walsh, until recently a professor of physiology and neuroscience at the University of Massachusetts Chan Medical School, has written on issues of peace and healthcare with the San Francisco Chronicle, the East Bay Times, the San Jose Mercury News, Asia Times, LA Progressive, Antiwar.com, CounterPunch, and others. John, welcome to the show. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Thanks for having me. I want to start with a quote from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Guterres said that the Palestinians had been, quote, subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation, telling the Security Council it is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas on October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. He went on to say, protecting civilians does not mean ordering more than 1 million to evacuate their homes and to evacuate to the south, where there is no shelter, food, water, medicine, or fuel, and then continuing to bomb the south. I am deeply concerned by the violations of international law we are witnessing in Gaza. This upset both the US and most especially Israel, to the point where Israel implied that the Secretary General was behaving essentially like a Nazi towards Jews, and the ambassador to Israel, the ambassador to the UN of Israel, donned a yellow star to wear in the chamber to indicate his how he felt he was being treated by Guterres. Now, the reason he was upset is because what essentially Guterres was saying is that history did not begin on October 7th with the attack by Hamas. There is a context to it. There's a background. There's a history. And the way that atrocities bad moves by the US empire and Israel are justified frequently is by beginning history at the time of their choosing. So here history begins on October 7th, just as the history of the Ukraine proxy war begins on February 24th, 2022. In each case, there's a context. And without that context in history, you cannot understand what's going on. And that's what disturbed the Israeli ambassador at that time. So what is the relevant background? Well, the relevant background might be is that in fact, Israel, due to the interventions of the Europeans, it was set up as a colonial settler state. And we frequently hear that term. What does it mean? That means a state that is colonized by Europeans. That's the way it has been in our historical epic. And the settlers, the Europeans who colonize it, live there and try to expel the native population and rule it as though the natives had never been there. And a good example of a colonial settler state that we can readily understand is the United States. The European settlers came and they killed or put on reservations the native population and ruled the continent. The land was theirs. So it involves essentially atrocities. And when there are atrocities and oppression, a response is to be expected. So the American Indians raided settlements and they fought the European settlers and the US Army. And they didn't do it simply because something arose in their soul that told them to hate others. No, they did it because they were aggrieved and they were oppressed and they were driven out of their homes. Well, the same thing happened in Israel. And we can look at the maps behind me. Actually, I'll turn myself off so you can see these maps. And these are very familiar to people, but I just want to go over this. The green in here shows the areas occupied by Palestinians, and the white areas occupied by Israeli Jewish settlers coming from Europe, and to some degree from the Americas, but basically from Europe. If you went, this is in 1947, if you went back even further to, let's say, 1870, 1890, when all of Palestine was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, this whole area would be green. There would be essentially no white spots. Only 5% of the population was Jewish. All the rest, or 85% of the rest, was Muslim. Here in 1947, the Jewish settlers from Europe had begun to come in, and we see these white areas of Jewish settlement. And then after the UN partitioned Palestine later on, we see that the areas allotted to the Palestinians, again, are in green. So now the country has been divided, and there's a Jewish population. In 1948, the Jewish population declared independence as the state of Israel and fought Arab armies, which they drove out and took over the land here. So we see now that by 1949, after the 1948 war, the Palestinians were limited to the West Bank and Gaza. And at that time, because of that war, about half the population, the Palestinian population, was driven out of their homes, driven into these areas or out of Israel altogether, a huge refugee population. And that occurrence, where 700,000, as I say, roughly half the Palestinian population was driven out, is known as the Nakba, or tragedy. And since then, the Jews of Israel, the Israelis as they call themselves, have taken over more and more area. So in the West Bank now, the Palestinian areas are broken up, which is very important, broken up by Jewish settlements. So it is now impossible to have a contiguous Palestinian state without a huge displacement of the Jews who live there, and that creates an enormous problem. So that's the Nakba, and that's the short history. And now we come to, and since that time, the Palestinians have rebelled from time to time. One of the first major rebellions was in 1987, but there were others before that, which was known as the First Intifada, and then some years later, a Second Intifada, in which the Palestinians rose up and tried to shake off their oppressors, tried to struggle to establish a Palestinian state. And that brings us, and they failed. And that brings us, because as you can see over my left shoulder, you can see that the Jews of Palestine, the Jews of Israel, continued to take up new areas. So that brings us to October 7th of this year, very short capsulated history, in which Hamas, and we'll get into more details of this, Hamas engaged in an attack on, broke out of Gaza and staged an attack on civilians and police and armed forces inside Israel in what was a big surprise. In response, Israel did the following. It, as of now, has totally blockaded 2.2 million civilians, essentially 2.2 million hostages, depriving them of food, water, and medicine. They've done a huge number of airstrikes on a population that has no air force, has essentially no anti-aircraft. And Netanyahu instructed all the people in Gaza, in northern Gaza, to leave their homes and go to the south. So he ordered over 1 million civilians out of their homes fast, or else they would be bombed. And finally, the military spokesman for the Netanyahu government said that eventually all people in Gaza must leave for Egypt. That is, this was Nakba 2.0, another ethnic cleansing or genocide. And Richard Falk, who is an expert on international law, summed it up this way. He said, in effect, as morbid as it seems, the Israeli leadership seized the occasion of 7 October to quote unquote finish the job by committing genocide in Gaza under the guise that Hamas was such a danger as to justify not only its destruction, but this indiscriminate onslaught against the whole population. So now we arrive at the present situation and the present problem, at least for the Israelis, because right now there are about 7.3 million Jews in historic Palestine and Israel, and 7.3 Palestinians. And the Palestinian population is growing faster. So for those who want an ethnically or religiously pure state, it is necessary to either ethnically cleanse those who are unwanted, namely the Palestinians, or kill them, or both. Otherwise, what will the outcome be? It'll either be one secular state in all of historic Palestine, or a two-state solution, which is impossible now without massive relocations inside the West Bank, because the Palestinian settlements, the Palestinian areas are no longer contiguous. So that is what Falk believes is the essence of this maneuver in the wake of October 7th, and that Netanyahu government has actually used this to mobilize the population and to win the U.S. and other allies to expelling the population from Gaza. And actually, the proposal has been that the people of Gaza should leave Gaza, and a tent city will be built for them or tent cities in the Egyptian Sinai. And the Egyptians want nothing to do with this, and nobody seems to want to pay for it. And Israel does not want to let the Gazans come back into Israel. So there we are stuck as the ethnic cleansing goes on. Now, what is very interesting about this is all this is happening in the age of the internet, and the people of the Middle East have access to the internet, and they're on this because of their common ancestry and religion. They have an affinity with the people in Gaza, and so the story of sufferings of the Gazan people are being told day after day on the internet, and the atrocities documented for all to see. And let me sum up what one outlet has said, called the Middle East Monitor, because I think it's important to know the scale of what's going on. It says Israel has dropped more than 25,000 tons of explosives on the besieged Gaza Strip since the start of its large-scale bombardment on 7 October. Hang on here. Equivalent to 2 nuclear bombs. That is according to Euromed Human Rights Monitor. The rights group said the Israeli army has admitted to bombing over 12,000 targets in the Gaza Strip, pounding the enclave with roughly 10 kilograms or 22 pounds of explosives per resident. The Monitor highlighted that the weight of the nuclear bombs dropped by the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan was estimated at 15,000 tons, adding that due to technological developments affecting the potency of bombs, the explosives dropped on Gaza may be twice as powerful as a nuclear bomb. This means, said the outlet, that the destructive power of the explosives dropped on Gaza exceeds that of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. According to the statement, Israel uses bombs with huge destructive power, some of which range up to 1,000 kilograms or 22,000 pounds, 22 tons, and cited a recent statement by Israeli War Minister Yoav Gallant that declared that more than 10,000 bombs have been dropped on Gaza City alone. The Geneva-based human rights group has also documented Israel's use of internationally banned weapons in its attacks on the Gaza Strip, especially the use of cluster bombs and phosphorus bombs, which can cause severe fatal burns. So whatever atrocities allegedly committed, and we'll get to that, they were not of this scale. This is entirely disproportionate. These are war crimes. And the disproportion is not surprising because, as Falk said, this is not meant really to get at Hamas. This is meant to ethnically cleanse Gaza. So there was the official story. We've heard the official story that of 1,400 people killed in the Palestinian attack on October 7th, and Palestinian officials, counter to that, have identified about almost 10,000 people killed in Gaza, Palestinians. And those statistics were met in the West by complete acceptance of what Israel had to say and complete skepticism about what the Palestinians had to say. And so the Gazans went to great lengths to document the people killed so far, and they published the names, the identity, the names of the people who had actually died in the bombing attack and other attacks. So that's the story, 1,400 people killed by a Palestinian attack. And along with that, there were some gory details also. So the question is, so Israeli then went on to try to identify the 1,300 or 1,400 people that they claim were killed by Palestinians. So far, they've only identified 933, whose names appeared in the Israeli paper Haaretz. And so that was the story, but that story quickly began to fall apart. The first thing I noticed was a young woman, Yasmin Porat, who escaped from the Hamas soldiers who captured her, said that in the crossfire, that when she escaped, her partner was killed not by Hamas, but by the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, in a crossfire. She came forward to the press and told her story, which I think was probably difficult for her after she got released, maybe because she was angry at the IDF for killing her partner. That was one thing. So already there's some suspicion about what was going on. Did Hamas kill these people, or did these people get killed in the crossfire? Then the story came out about beheaded babies. The atrocity, the story was put out that bodies of beheaded infants had been found, and that they were, it was said that Hamas had beheaded them. But it was quickly found out that that was a falsehood. That was a rumor spread by an IDF soldier known for his participation in attacks on Palestinians. It came out on the Israeli equivalent of the Voice of America, echoed by CNN, echoed by Netanyahu, echoed by Biden. And it turns out there was never any evidence for it. And CNN actually had to take it back. And it turns out, as Code Pink reported, in the list, Haaretz list of dead, there was no one under 4 years of age. So there were no babies. In other words, this was the latest iteration of the incubator babies that was made up to justify the US invasion of Kuwait in the first Gulf War. And it turned out to be very powerful and won many people over to the Gulf War, when at that time, George H.W. Bush told the story about them, totally fabricated, as we learned later on. In this case, the story was quickly, amazingly quickly, shown to be false. Even to go further with this, when the Harrods list of dead Israelis was released, it was found that they were not completely civilians. That at least 361 of the 933 dead, the ones identified so far, and they haven't gotten up to the anywhere near 1,300 or 1,400, were soldiers, police, and security forces. So at most, 572 civilians were killed by Hamas. Still a terrible number, but the whole story hasn't been told yet. What about those 572? How many of those were killed by Hamas? How many of those were killed by the IDF? How many actually exist? So we're going to have to, we will have to see about that, but the story is not as it was told originally. And so the disproportion between what Hamas was alleged to do and what the Israelis said was done is growing. Now, while we're at Hamas, Hamas, as a matter of fact, was a creature of Israel. It was set up in large part by Israel to actually bring down the Palestine Liberation Organization. And Netanyahu was one of the people who aided in doing that. And as late as 2019, Netanyahu is telling his party, and it's recorded, it's on the internet, that we have to continue funding Hamas because Hamas is the key for breaking up the movement for Palestinian liberation. So Hamas has turned out is in part, not completely, but in part suspect because of its origins and because who has a hold on it. So one might ask, why has the narrative, Israel's narrative, broken down and not taken hold in the West the way, say, the narrative on the proxy war in Ukraine did? Well, one thing is very clear, that we have been able to see, because of the reporting coming out of the Arab world, the bombing and suffering on the internet. It's very clear. And people have seen it day after day after day now, and actually to see it close, and a lot of it isn't shown readily in the West. The people at the gray zone have shown a lot of the horrible things, if you can bear looking at them, that have taken place as a result of the bombing of Gaza. And so after we see that, I was looking at the New York Times editorial page yesterday, and I saw something that was written there by a guest piece written by Isaac Herzog, the president of Israel. And it's very hard to believe once you see these images. And what did Herzog say? He wrote in the New York Times, and it is not just between Israel and Hamas, this fight. It is between those who adhere to norms of humanity, that is Israel, and those practicing a barbarism that has no place in the modern world. Now think about that. After what people have seen on television, day in and day out, Herzog says, the battle is between those who adhere to the norms of humanity, that is, what we're seeing in Gaza, and those practicing a barbarism that has no place in the modern world. When one reads that after what one has seen on the internet, and even on TV in some instances, one has to ask, who is obeying the norms of humanity and who are the barbarians? So this information has gotten out, and it's gone further because, this is the second reason why the narrative is broken down. There's an Arab and Muslim population in the West, and they have a loyalty to the Palestinians, loyalty that is easily understood. The same ethnic group, same religion, same traditions, and they've also seen themselves attacked. There was a Palestinian boy who was killed near Chicago because his neighbor, who must be somewhat demented, was hearing all this bad mouthing of Palestinians, and he went and he stabbed the little 6-year-old boy, killed him, and stabbed his mother. So this is a very dangerous kind of rhetoric that's out there. It's reminiscent, actually, of Asian Americans being attacked on the street every time there's a lot of anti-China rhetoric. And so that's the second reason why this narrative has not taken hold. I would say a third reason is that the ground was not prepared so carefully for this narrative as it was, for example, in the case of with the proxy war in Ukraine, where the anti-Putin, anti-Russia stuff began with Russiagate years and years ago, and even before that, with some of the other attempts at color revolutions. So this was not well prepared, this new Israeli adventure. There's another thing, too, that Ray McGovern mentions that in all of this, we often now speak of the multipolar world, but there is another way to look at the world, as he points out, that sometimes the world divides into a bipolar world. And sometimes it's the West, that is Europe, the Anglo-Saxon world together with Europe, what has been called by the chief diplomat of the European Union as the garden, and the jungle, the rest of the world. So Israeli Jews of European origin, part of the garden. Palestinians, part of the jungle. And the people, so this is really a racist look at the world. And when people detect that, they fight back, and they'll support people who are labeled as and treated as residents of the jungle by residents of the garden. Another reason why the narrative hasn't been working so well is there has been work for a long time on the plight of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. There have been 2 intifadas, and at time of each of those intifadas, there were demonstrations, not of this magnitude, and there were people educating the population of the West about what has been going on in Palestine. As a matter of fact, way back in 1987, at the time of the first Intifada, I remember I was living in Cambridge, Mass. At that time, and was part of a group. We set up something we called it the Coalition for Palestinian Rights, and we put a pro-Palestinian, well, I don't want to call it a pro-Palestinian. We put on the local ballot public policy question, a tradition there saying, look, the atrocities going on now in Israel against the Palestinians who are rebelling against a terribly oppressive rule, and we should stop funding it. So we called for no more funding given to Israel to oppress the Intifada. And after some work, we didn't have much money, and everybody in the whole city was opposing us, at least all the establishment. We won. And that provided some education, even if only in one small place like Cambridge, Massachusetts. And there were people around the country doing the same thing, both at the first and second Intifada. And I think that stuff has consequences and lingers on. So the narrative this time didn't get across the way it has in the past. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the consequences of this. And first of all, and some of these are listed by Chas Freeman, who's a senior U.S. diplomat, has been one for decades, was the interpreter for in the Mao-Nixon talks as a young man. And what Chas Freeman says quite frankly is this is not a war, it's mass murder and continuation of expulsion policy. And he further says, on October 7th, Hamas did to a small group of people what Israelis have been doing to all the Palestinians for over a century in historic Palestine. So what are the consequences that Freeman sees of this this tragedy. First of all, he says that the U.S. has isolated itself in the world. I think that is shown up best in the UN General Assembly vote on a ceasefire. The vote there, which called for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities, was 120 in favor of the truce, 14 against, and 45 abstaining. 120 nations voted for the ceasefire and against the US and Israel, who were against the ceasefire. And if we look at the nations that are voting, only 12 countries sided with Israel and the US. And they were 2 from Latin America, Guatemala and Paraguay. 6 were small island nations in the Pacific. And only 4 were from Europe. They were from Eastern Europe, Austria, Croatia, Czechia, and Hungary. So only 12 countries in the world actually sided with Israel and the US against the ceasefire. On the other hand, the countries that voted for a truce included many traditional US allies: France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Norway, Ireland, Switzerland, New Zealand, while other US allies like the United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, and Japan were among the 45 countries that abstained. So the United States was really isolated on this one. Furthermore, not a single country from Western Europe, Africa, the mainland of Asia, the Caribbean, or the Middle East voted with the US and Israel. That is remarkable. And actually, the US was similarly isolated in votes in the Security Council on a truce, a ceasefire. In the last vote, only the United States actually voted against it. Nobody on the Security Council took the side of the United States on that vote. So now, what is the United States offering in response? Well, Tony Blinken has offered what he calls a humanitarian pause against a ceasefire and for a pause. And I have been wondering, what is a humanitarian pause? And again, yesterday in the New York Times, there was an editorial by the editorial board, and the pause was defined, kind of. So it was defined, the editorial board said a pause in hostilities between Hamas and the Israeli Defense Forces would not be, as Mr. Netanyahu declared recently, a surrender to terrorism, nor is a pause the equivalent of a ceasefire. So we know the pause is not a ceasefire. The fighting will go on, as a White House official noted. So Israel has warned that a blanket ceasefire would accomplish little at this point other than allowing Hamas time to regroup. Of course, it would also give Israel the chance to do that. But in any event, they also alluded to White House spokesman John Kirby, who tried to define, in response to reporters' questions, what the humanitarian was. He said, well, the difference between a humanitarian pause and a ceasefire is quote, a question of duration and scope and size and that kind of thing. That kind of thing. That's it. But the New York Times editorial goes on to define it a little more carefully. It says a humanitarian pause would also allow more of the millions of civilians who remain in Gaza an opportunity to move to relative safety until the hostilities end. The Rafah border was opened earlier this week, allowing hundreds of foreigners, including dozens of Americans, to leave Gaza and enter Egypt. In other words, ethnic cleansing is part of the idea of the pause. It will give Gazans a chance to get out and be driven into the desert in Egyptian territory when Egyptian wants no part of it. So I would call the pause a fake ceasefire. So So we see in all these things an indication of the isolation of the United States and Israel around the world. And there have been demonstrations against the horrors in Gaza all over the planet, also, including here in the United States. Right here in San Francisco, there have been 2 demonstrations of thousands and thousands of people, much bigger demonstrations than we've seen over anything in many years. And another consequence, so that's one consequence, the isolation of the United States. The second consequence is that the so-called Arab street has been reminded, that is the population of the Arab countries, the grassroots, has been reminded of the plight of the Palestinians. That has had 2 effects. First of all, it's made it difficult, as in the Abraham Accords, for the Israelis to make agreements with Arab countries at the expense of the Palestinian situation. In other words, to make agreements, say, well, let's get along together, forget about the Palestinians. That's going to be much harder. As a matter of fact, one of the agreements that was made in the so-called Abraham Accords with Bahrain, one of the signatories to those accords, has been seems to be in trouble because Bahrain has recalled its ambassadors to Israel and suspended all economic relations with Israel. So already that has begun to unravel. Excuse me a second. So I just dropped the AirPod here. Let me see if I can get it. How does that work? Hear me again, Mike? Are you hearing me okay?
Yes, I can hear you
Okay,
fine.
okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So for example, Egypt has full diplomatic relations with Egypt it has full diplomatic relations with Egypt and Jordan. Half the population of Jordan is Palestinians. Those diplomatic relations may crumble, which is bad for Israel and for the U.S. because when Israel suffers setback, it's why U.S. suffers a setback. And on the other hand, countries then at odds with one another, for example, Turkey and Iran, have come together to oppose the slaughter in Gaza. Erdogan of Turkey has called Hamas freedom fighters, not terrorists. Throughout the Middle East, nations odds have come together over this issue, and this in turn threatens to spread the conflict. Ebola, Iran, Syria, and others may come in, and then maybe even Russia. This is another geopolitical consequence is that we're in danger of tipping over a wider war, which then, with Russia and the U.S. both involved, could become a nuclear war. So it's become a very dangerous situation. Finally, another consequence is that the U.S. uses human rights to advance its interest in the world. It's crucial. It always finds some human rights to defend whenever it wants a revolution or to take over a country or some of its resources. That the standing of the United States as a champion of human rights, given its backing of what's going on in Gaza, as a matter of fact, providing the weapons for going on in Gaza, is very damaging to the U.S. Reputation as a champion of human rights. It will be hard to call out China on alleged abuses in Xinjiang after what the United States has backed in Gaza. Finally, there's a big consequence for China because this is the second time Middle East that China, the comparison between China, it's the second time recently, there's a stark comparison, a great difference between what China is doing and what the United States is doing. Right now, China is on the side of a ceasefire and a two-state solution, genuinely sovereign Palestinians, well as Jews in historic Palestine. Meanwhile, while China is advocating sovereignty for both sides, the U.S. is waging, actually, you could call it, is aiding Israel in a genocidal attack on Gaza.
That's a difference. As a matter of fact, while the United States is doing that, what was China doing on October 7th to 19th? It was hosting the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing. And what is Belt and Road Forum? It's an international political and economic forum of the Belt and Road Initiative. 150 countries and 40 heads of state attended. So we have over here, the U.S. is involved in another Middle East war. Over here, China involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. And what was the forum? I'll give you a memory from China. The forum was a platform for working out action plans for implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative in the area of infrastructure, energy and resources, production capacity, trade and investment, and a dedication of major projects. It's also intended to be an opportunity for the signing of cooperation agreements with countries and international organizations in the areas of financial cooperation, mechanism, etc. It's very detailed. As a matter of fact, it even sounds a little bit boring. But what it is an effort to provide a better living to people who joined the road initiative. It's an effort to build and develop, not to war and divide and take down. And for everybody in the world who's looking, it's a stark contrast. And it's the second time we've seen that, because when the United States was fixed on proxy attention on its proxy war in Ukraine, what was China doing a few months back? It was mediating a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, who one another's for decades. So here we had a rapprochement between Sunnis and done at China. China comes in, the United States is peddling yet another set of wars and brings together its adversaries, brings more peace. Again, the same contrast. So I think that the contrast between China and the U.S. is a standout all of this. Finally, I think another consequence is the elections in the U.S. and the EU, and maybe elsewhere, will be affected by this, because as the population of both the United States and other countries, especially in Europe, turn against this war, as against the war in Ukraine, the regimes that will now in power may lose that war. And to the degree that they're warmongers, that's all to the good. So in an article, finally, to conclude here, in an article by Code Pink by Medea and Benjamin and J.S. Davies, they point out that the leaders of the United States and Israel are not only out of touch with the world, but with their own population. For example, in Israel, an Arab poll of Israel found that public support immediate large-scale ground offensive of Gaza had fallen from 65% October 17th to only 20% a week later. And it's interesting, over that period, the narrative about what happened at October 7th had begun to collapse. Similarly, in America, a Data for Progress poll published on October 20th found that 66 Americans wanted their government to call ceasefire and de-escalation of violence in Gaza, and to leverage its close diplomatic relationship with Israel to prevent violence and civilian deaths. But that's not what we were doing it then. We were taking our government, our administration was taking precisely the opposite. And what else was Congress doing? First act the new House leader passed was one on October 24th, bill promising additional military support for Israel's campaign in Gaza, passed by a vote of 412 to 10. And then on November 2nd, last Thursday, House passed $14.3 billion in military aid for Israel in the face of this American sentiment. In contrast, a letter calling for ceasefire, which was put forward by Representative Cory Bush of Missouri, only attracted 18 members of Congress to sign it, which is really sad. So it shows that As a matter of fact, another consequence here is now the United States out of touch with its citizens. It's told that hey, Americans, when you travel now, are in increased danger because of resentment of our role in Gaza. And the State Department has basically said, you're on your own if you run into trouble. So to conclude, I'd like to conclude with the Davies' invention article suggestions for a set of demands that activists should put forward in dealing with the demands of our government in the United States, because that's what we should be concerned with. Is one, stop fueling the occupation and endless supply of weapons. No weapons to Israel. Two, stop diplomatically shielding Israel from national efforts to end the occupation. And three, the U.S. has failed in its role as a mediator and broker. So we should tell our government it's time for the U.S. to step aside and allow real mediators to come in and take that role. Excellent set of three demands, and I think it points the way forward. That's a little history from my viewpoint of what's been going on and its implications. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, John. That was a great interview. Actually, it wasn't an interview so much as a presentation. Thank you for that. I like the way you kind of compared at the very end the difference of the roles between the United States and China, not only in the Middle East, but in the rest of the world. China basically stood with the rest of the world, most of the global South, even some European countries, certainly Russia, and certainly a lot of the Middle East nations, most of the Middle East nations, and advocated a ceasefire and negotiation, which obviously is the only way this problem can ever get solved. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for doing all this.
And we'll conclude there. Thank you to everybody who's watching, and we'll see you in the next video.